let's go back in time. The year is 1950. India is a brand new nation, and it has this incredible new constitution, just full of promises of freedom for its people. But, promises are one thing. The real test is what happens when they're challenged. Today, we're diving into the very first case that put the meaning of personal liberty in India on trial, and the decision that limited it for nearly 3 decades.
And this is the question that's really at the heart of our story today. Just think about that for a second. Can the government take away your freedom as long as it just checks all the right boxes? It sounds simple, but the answers shape the relationship between the Indian citizen and the state for a generation. Can a law be technically correct but still be fundamentally unjust? Let's see how the Supreme Court first tried to answer that.
So picture it, 1950. The air in India is just electric with the promise of a new beginning. And at the center of it all is the new constitution, which included a charter of fundamental rights. This was meant to be a shield, right? A guarantee that the oppression of the colonial era was gone for good. And right at the core of that shield was the right to life and personal liberty.
And this single sentence, Article 21, well, it became a massive legal battleground. The real kicker, that phrase, procedure established by law. Now, what's so interesting is that this wasn't an accident. The folks who wrote the Constitution, they actually debated using the broader American phrase, due process of law, but they specifically chose this more restrictive wording. And that raised a huge question. Did this just mean the government had to follow the rules as they were written, no matter how unfair those rules might be? Or did it mean the rules themselves had to be fair and just?
So, this is where our protagonist, A.K. Gopalan, comes into the picture. He was a prominent communist leader, and in the very tense political climate of the early 1950s, the government was worried about dissent, so they passed a really powerful law, the Preventive Detention Act. This law let them imprison people without a trial, just to prevent crimes they might commit in the future. Gopalan gets detained under this act, and he decides to fight back. But he didn't just challenge his own arrest, he challenged the entire law itself.
So Gopalan's legal team didn't just make one argument. They came at it from all sides. They argued that this law didn't just violate his personal liberty under Article 21, but also his freedom to move around under Article 19, and the basic protections against arrest in Article 22. They were basically asking the court, are these fundamental rights a package deal, a safety net for citizens, or can the government just pick and choose which ones to follow? And now, the ball is in the Supreme Court's court. This is their first huge test. How are they going to interpret these fundamental rights? Are they going to take a big, broad view that protects the citizen? Or are they going to take a narrow, literal view that protects the power of the state? The path they chose was going to set the stage for decades to come. Okay, so the court had this big choice to make, right? It was between two totally different ways of thinking. On one hand, you have procedure established by law, which is basically a checklist approach. Did the government follow the steps written down? Yes or no? On the other hand, you have due process of law, which asks a much deeper question. Hey, is this law even fair to begin with? The court looks at the text of the Constitution and chose the first path, the narrower, more literal one.
And the logic they used, honestly, it was chillingly simple. It basically went like this. Step 1. Is there a law with a procedure? Yes, the Preventive Detention Act. Step 2. Did the government follow it? Yep. Step 3. Okay then, the detention is legal. The court explicitly said it was not their job to ask if the law itself was fair, just, or reasonable.
And this quote, it just perfectly sums up the whole majority view. It was a cold, mechanical interpretation. As long as the government was following its own rulebook, it didn't matter how harsh that rulebook might be, it was constitutional. The what didn't matter, only the how.
But wait, you might be thinking, what about all those other rights Gopalan mentioned? Freedom of movement and all that. Well, this is where the court got creative. They came up with this new legal idea, a concept that would have some pretty far-reaching consequences. They decided that fundamental rights weren't a unified whole, but more like separate, little self-contained codes. Basically, the court argued that Article 22, the one about arrest and detention, was its own little instruction manual, a completely separate booklet. So if the government followed the procedures in that specific manual, it could effectively ignore other fundamental rights, like the right to move freely. In the court's view, these rights didn't overlap. They existed in their own separate silos.
But here's the thing about this story. That ruling didn't last forever. It cast a really long shadow, for sure, but the story of India's constitution is all about growth, about evolution. It took almost 3 decades, but eventually, this initial interpretation of liberty was seen as a mistake, one that had to be corrected.
For nearly 30 years, that Gopalan judgment was the law of the land, and it gave the state a scary amount of power. The balance was tilted heavily in favor of procedure over the actual substance of freedom. A law could be completely unjust yet still be considered constitutional, and this had terrifying real-world consequences, especially during the 1975 emergency, when this very ruling was used to justify mass detentions and suspend freedoms across the entire country.
And this is where we get the big payoff. In 1978, in another game-changing case, Maneka Gandhi versus the Union of India, the Supreme Court did a complete 180. It explicitly overruled its old decision in Gopalan. The court declared that procedure established by law must also be fair, just, and reasonable. The checklist? Gone. Thrown out. And the era of looking at the substance of justice finally began. The rights were finally seen as connected, as they were meant to be.
And that leaves us with this final thought. The journey from the Gopalan case to the Maneka Gandhi case is more than just a legal story. It's the story of a constitution and a country learning and growing. It forces us all to ask a question that's just as important today as it was then. Where do we draw the line between the power of the state and the freedom of the individual? And is just following the rules ever enough if the rules themselves aren't fair?